some of them for many years. And thank you to the scores of allies across the country who have been fighting for reforms for a long time. Your work is paying off. We're on the brink of a historic moment for public safety. For years, our prison system grew in spending and declined in results. Conservative principles were not applied to our correction system. But then, things started to change. You see, 11 years ago in Texas, we were facing a crisis, both in our state budget and in our prison system. With a strong conservative leadership of Governor Perry, we charted a new path. Investing in treatment beds and strengthening our probation and parole systems allowed prosecutors more flexibility. The prison population dropped, while recidivism and reoffending also dropped. Most importantly, Texas is now seeing its lowest crime rate since 1966. This is why all of us here today are proud to say that this is truly conservative reform. We as conservatives share common goals. We want strong communities and institutions. We want those who have done wrong to be punished and then to seize their own redemption without state interference. Most of all, we want safe neighborhoods, neighborhoods that allow each and every member of our society to flourish. That's why we're gathered here in support of the First Step Act, modeled after the successful reforms enacted by conservative legislatures in states like Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina. This piece of legislation represents a modest, though sorely needed, shift to reducing recidivism. With 95% of inmates returning to our communities, it's incumbent on our correction system to get it right and to get it right the first time. Failing to do so is simply too dangerous and not conservative. Today, you're going to hear some brief remarks from across the conservative movement. We'll hear from fiscal conservatives, from faith leaders, from philanthropists, from elected officials, and even law enforcement. Each of us recognizes that conservative governance leads to the best outcomes for society, and that this applies doubly for our prison system. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Senator Mike Lee from the great state of Utah.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking each and every person who's standing behind me today. I've been involved in the effort for criminal justice reform for nearly all of the 8 years I've spent in the United States Senate so far. And I want to make one thing very clear at the outset. I am a supporter of criminal justice reform, not in spite of, but because of my conservatism. And I support criminal justice reform not in spite of, but because of my experience as a former federal prosecutor. We have to remember that every time government acts, it does so at the expense of individual liberty. That has to be taken into account each and every time. And as a conservative, I monitor that. It doesn't mean I detest government or despise it or always avoid it. Government is necessary. It's especially necessary in order to protect innocent people from the harmful effects of dangerous, violent, and criminal behavior. But we have to examine the actions of government to make sure that government intrusions into individual liberty and government impacts on a family, on communities, on institutions of civil society are properly evaluated and understood in context. While it may be argued by some that we'd always be better off to just take everyone who shows any sign of nonconformity with the law and lock them up forever, who wants to live in that society? Moreover, if we were to take that approach, we would inevitably find that the whirlwind we would reap from that wouldn't be altogether positive. We've seen what happens when we take away somebody's brother or son or uncle or nephew or father, and we warehouse them for decades at a time. It's not always a good outcome. It's not always the outcome that we claim to want as a society, which is to protect innocent Americans from the dangers of crime. What we want is to punish people adequately and offer those who are being punished more than adequate opportunities for rehabilitation so that they don't reoffend when they get out. I've been inspired by a number of things in this effort. One point that I would refer all of you to is a movie that came out this year called The Sentence. It tells the story of a young woman named Cindy who got caught up in the federal criminal justice system and experienced some of the inherent inequities that can arise in that system. Another experience is one that I had as a federal prosecutor, where I used to work here with my friend Brett Tolman. Brett and I have been friends since law school. We clerked together for the same judge. We were later assistant U.S. attorneys together in the District of Utah. There was a young man who was prosecuted by our office during my time there named Weldon Angelos. Weldon was in his mid-20s. He had 2 young children at the time, and he got caught selling 3 dime bag quantities, small user quantities of marijuana while armed. Although he was armed, he didn't use his weapon in connection with the offense. He didn't brandish it or discharge it, but because of the way Weldon was charged and the fact that he had a gun on his person at the time, he received a minimum mandatory sentence of 55 years in prison. Now, the judge who imposed the sentence in that case, himself not a shrinking violet, himself not somebody who's soft on crime, himself a former federal prosecutor, then federal district judge Paul Cassell, took the unusual, almost unheard of step of issuing a published opinion disagreeing with the sentence he himself was about to impose. And he made some interesting comments in there, comments that have stayed with me ever since. He said there are hijackers, there are murderers, there are rapists, there are terrorists who do not get anywhere near this amount of time. And yet I, as a federal district judge, have no choice but to sentence this young man to 55 years in prison. He'll be about 80 by the time he gets out, as he explained in his opinion. And then he said something that would haunt me ever since. He said, only Congress can fix this problem, because judges in some cases have no discretion to deal with situations like these. Only Congress can fix this problem. Those words have been haunting me ever since, and ever since I arrived in the United States Senate. And I'm grateful for this great coalition of conservative leaders who recognize that it's not in spite of, but because of our conservatism, that we should want a criminal justice system that recognizes the immense and indeed infinite worth of the individual human soul, and also recognizes that when communities and families and neighborhoods and faith organizations suffer as a result of individual members being taken out and warehoused for decades at a time unnecessarily, it hurts everyone and it leads to an increased crime rate, making Americans less safe rather than more. But thank you very much to each of you for being here. I look forward to answering your questions and hearing from my allies in this effort.
My name is Ken Cuccinelli. I was Attorney General across the river here in Virginia, on the right side of the river, as I like to refer to it, and take a back seat to no one in being tough on crime. Conservatives are by nature tough on crime. Public safety is one of the highest priorities of government. And this bill, advocated and advanced by Senator Lee and many others, to whom I'm grateful, is tough on crime. It will lower crime. How do we know it will lower crime? Because we're using methods that have already been tried in states and have worked. When I was Attorney General, I got the longest gang sentence in Virginia history. We increased child predator prosecutions to the highest level ever. I put human trafficking on the map, and I still hold the record nationally. Hear that, Texas? Nationally, for the most money recovered in healthcare fraud cases, Medicaid fraud, by any Attorney General in one term. I am tough on crime, conservatives are tough on crime, and this bill does not give an inch in being tough on crime. It will reduce crime. That is our goal. That is one of our goals. As conservatives, we also recognize that no one is beyond redemption. We also recognize that we have a responsibility to be stewards of taxpayer dollars, something that doesn't get a lot of attention here on the federal side, but in states that have balanced budget requirements, it's been a big part of the motivation that started this laboratory of democracy effort in conservative states. It has been successful in those conservative states. I'm so pleased to see it come to the federal government, and it wouldn't have happened without people like Senator Lee, Senator Paul, who hopefully will join us. And of course, it would not happen if President Trump had not gotten behind this effort. We had a previous administration that spent 8 years talking about criminal justice reform and used the issue to divide us. That's all it was ever used for. Now we have a president who's getting behind a bill that has bipartisan support and is on the verge of passage if conservatives will stick together in support of this legislation in the Senate. So thank you, Senator Lee, all of your colleagues that are supporting the First Step Act and all of the Senate amendments. and all those in the House who supported it overwhelmingly as well. We look forward to this becoming law and reducing crime in America. Thank you. Well, actually, we're on the prosecutor role here. Senator Lee told you he had prosecuted. Obviously, I was an attorney general, and it's my pleasure to introduce Brett Tolman, who you've already heard a little bit about, who's also one of the prosecutors we have here with us today. Brett, thanks.
Folks, great to be with you. Appreciate this opportunity. As you heard, I'm apparently known as the friend of Senator Mike Lee. I'll tell you, yes, I lost to him in moot court, and I seem to be, following him. I'm proud to follow him anywhere. But I will tell you that I was the U.S. Attorney in Utah for almost 4 years, appointed by President Bush. And before that, I was a federal prosecutor in the trenches. I've been tough on crime. In my last act as U.S. Attorney, I prosecuted the kidnapper of Elizabeth Smart. I'm very proud of the fact that he is serving for the rest of his life, as I think is appropriate. So how does a former federal prosecutor, former U.S. Attorney get involved in criminal justice reform? I'll tell you why. We get involved because we know the system intimately, and we become aware of malfunctions, and we become aware of areas that need improvement. And that's why I have, and I hold here, and I address the critics of this bill. You may know who they are: senators who have argued that it's a jailbreak, senators who have argued that they need more time to read it. I did read it 3 times in the last 2 days. I will tell you this, though. There are 172 names on this letter. It is led by former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, former Attorney General Alberto Gonzalez, former Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson, over 100 former U.S. attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys, conservatives, prosecutors, tough on crime individuals. Why would they sign a letter asking for this bill to be passed? The reason is they know that the criminal justice system wields enormous power to affect the lives of those that are within its crosshairs. And if that power is wielded in a way that is abusive, or it is overburdensome, or we over-criminalize or over-incarcerate, these are the same folks that don't want those unjust results. We fight for justice. There are 3 things that you are taught as a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor. Your threefold mission is punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The one area I never heard focused in the Department of Justice was rehabilitation. What this bill does is maintain all of the powerful tools prosecutors have, but enable individuals within the Department of Justice to do and achieve that 3rd goal, which is to lower recidivism, to follow states like Texas and Georgia and South Carolina and Utah and others, which have worked so hard to show the world you can be smart on crime and you can help those that are incarcerated come out of the system better prepared to live a life that is productive. And I'd like to meet the prosecutor that doesn't want that. I appreciate this opportunity, and it's my pleasure to now turn to Commissioner Carrick, who I enjoy following on Twitter.
Thank you. Barney Carrick. I was the 40th Police Commissioner of the New York City Police Department. I was in command of the NYPD on September 11th. Better? And what a lot of people may not know is that prior to running the NYPD, which is the largest police department in the country, I ran the largest jail system in the country, the New York City jail system, including Rikers Island, at a time when we had 133,000 inmate admissions, and we averaged, when Giuliani came into office, 150 stabbings and slashings per month. And I bring that up for a particular reason that I'll get to in a second. 2004, I was nominated by President Bush to take over Homeland Security. That nomination imploded, and I wound up going to federal prison for 4 years. I was inside for three years and 11 days. So prior to getting there, I was as hard-nosed law and order as you could imagine. From the death penalty on down, everything was a go. And then I got to federal prison. And I met young black men out of Baltimore, Washington, D.C., that were sentenced on conspiracy charges, no drugs, they got 10, 15 years. First time, non-violent, low-level offenders, 10 years. Somebody sold a whale's tooth on eBay, a year in prison. Commercial fishermen caught too many fish. And, you know, I get it, there's punishment, but I realize very quickly, we, in the federal system especially, we over-punish, and we have no incentives for good behavior. And this goes to what Brett and Mike Lee and Ken was saying earlier. There's no incentives for good behavior. Let me tell you about some of the programs real quick within the BOP today, or when I was there, which was 4 years ago. You want incentivized programs for good behavior to reduce recidivism, to get people jobs. Where I was, those programs were crocheting, knitting, checkers, chess, navigating eBay. They didn't have computers. It's horrendous. You need to incentivize good behavior in the prisons for two reasons. And this goes back to my time at Rikers. We averaged 150 stabbings and slashings per month. We knocked that down by about 93%. The reason I bring that up, that's the one thing that this bill does that nobody's talking about. There's nothing more important than keeping our federal prisons safe for staff and inmates alike. When you have incentivized programs that's going to require good behavior, those inmates are going to behave themselves. That's a benefit to staff and inmates alike. We need real programs. You know, there's 500,000 CDL licenses required in this country. Truck drivers, we need filled. HVAC systems, mechanical, automotive mechanics, restoration. These are programs you can take into the Bureau of Prisons, and men and women will jump on them because they want a new life. They want to get back into their communities. If you do that, if you incentivize good behavior, if you incentivize programs, if they are granted the programs, get through the programs, they go back to the community a better person. As some of the speakers mentioned, the opposition to this bill is to do nothing. And I got news for you. Prison is a training ground for thuggery and criminality. They learn how to steal, cheat, lie, manipulate, gamble, and fight. They think that a verbal altercation has to end in a beatdown or somebody getting cut. That's not what I want back in my community. I want people that learn respect and discipline and work ethic, and they're gonna go back home and get a job, take care of their families, and never come back to prison. That's what this bill does. That's the primary thing this bill does, and this is the time to do it. The opposition, their solution is to do nothing. We've done nothing long enough. It's time for that to change. Thank you.
I am Pastor Paula White. I served as the chairwoman of President Trump's Faith Advisory Board during his campaign. I am now his spiritual advisor and leader of the Faith Initiative and Opportunity. I hold in my hand 3,072 signatures of the highest level of faith leaders in this nation. It represents every major denomination. It represents Hispanic, African American, Caucasian community, almost 100 million people. You say, why is the faith community so behind this? Because we're the ground troops. We all have churches, parishes, we have people that are affected. There is not a person that sits in our church that is not impacted in some way by either a family member or friend that has gone through the prison system or is in it. We start from beginning to the end. And I just want to read you the sentiments of what the faith community feels. To the majority leaders, it says, as you know, this legislation passed by an overwhelming vote in the House in May. And now there's a critical window of opportunity to improve upon the bill by adding sentencing reform amendments that will bring relief to the families and communities most impacted by crime and incarceration. Please move this amended legislation forward as quickly as possible. As leaders of community of faith, we have a centuries-old mandate to care for prisoners and their families. It is our responsibility, and it is a joy. We have rejoiced with so many people whose lives have been profoundly changed when they have been afforded a second chance. Our work throughout the nation's criminal justice system also affirms the need for our federal government to take practical actions, like those outlined in this bill and the proposed sentencing amendments, in order to ensure just punishment, to reduce recidivism by giving prisoners a better chance of rebuilding their lives, their families, and contributing to society. As representatives of millions, literally, in my hand, representative of millions of religious Americans, we have seen how so many in our own communities have been affected by disproportionate sentences and the inadequacies in our prison system, and we believe there is widespread support for these reforms. In conclusion, this legislation will improve public safety by implementing the use of risk assessment, individualized prison program plans, and opportunities for supervised release. The sentencing reforms will restore more proportional sentencing enhancements and allow for greater judicial flexibility in certain cases. This legislation will allow men and women in our federal prisons to return home sooner and better prepared to give back to their families and communities at their highest potential. We stand ready to support the men and women who return by welcoming them into our congregations. We look forward to celebrating with you this historic piece of legislation, which is the right thing to do, and it's a smart thing to do. We urge you from the faith community to act now.
I'm Dr. Harry Jackson, pastor of Hope Christian Church in the greater DC area. I oversee a network of about 7,000 churches internationally. I'm here to tell you that this is the biggest civil rights issue of our generation. America is only 5% of the world's population, 25% of the incarcerated populations. The over-criminalization of the black community, Hispanic communities, is an egregious abuse of power in my way of thinking. This is a beginning step of reformation. And yes, I want to say it publicly, I'm a black conservative, which is sort of like an oxymoron, but as you live and breathe, I'm here. I believe in the Bible. I believe that there should be restoration of opportunity for folks. Many of our families are not going to see their dads come home for the holidays. Our families are disintegrating in our urban communities because of this egregious sentencing processes and the lack of a clear way of bringing people home and giving them another opportunity at life. I think about our own local church, just one local church, not the 7,000 we oversee. Our own local church, over the last 5 years, we trained over 500 people to go in and take the gospel to people who are incarcerated, hopefully helping them to reestablish their values and get a renewed opportunity to recapture and regain their lives. A church I'm friendly with has helped 1,300 people come out of prison and get jobs. And this is the Living Word Christian Center in Chicago. They have 6 buses that help folks who have recently been incarcerated get to their jobs after they've been released. There is an army of local churches that want to do more, but we don't understand why more legislation isn't acted on right now. This is an urgent issue, and in the words of Jesse Jackson, who I rarely ever quote, keep hope alive. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Doug Deason. I'm president of the Deason Foundation in Dallas, Texas. I'm also the co-founder of the Deason Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the Devon School at SMU. I'm proud not to be a lawyer, with a few non-lawyers up here. Everything we've done in Texas is now being, or not everything, but most of the things we've done in Texas are being done in this bill. I became an advisor to Jared Kushner right out a year and a half ago on a criminal justice reform, and we put together a group on the right to start this process. And I brought Brooke Rollins with me, who's now an assistant to the president. He hired her away, unfortunately, from Texas Public Policy Foundation, and she's missed, but she's doing an incredible job here. It's been a lot of fun to work with them and to work on this bill. I think that's what's important, is it's proven. We've done it in Texas. Other states have done it as well. We're not trying to do anything in this bill that hasn't already been proven at the state level. At the federal level, there's nothing done that improves people's lives. If people come out of prison, they're trapped in their zip codes, they have no ability to rise above. And that's why my family is involved through the foundation in supporting criminal justice reform, because we believe in empowering the poor to lift themselves out of poverty. I just also like to point out to the critics and the opposition in the Senate that specifically in the GOP platform, we put language in 2016, taking it increasing it. It's better than what the Democrats have. It's better than what we had in 2012. And it specifically calls for not only sentencing reform, but prison reentry reform. It's a mandate to our politicians to act upon these issues, and how these senators can oppose it, I have no idea, because it's specifically spelled out what they're supposed to be doing in the 2016 GOP platform. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Malcolm. I am the Vice President of the Institute for Constitutional Government and the Director of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Like Senator Lee and my friend Brett Tolman, for a number of years I was an in-the-trenches federal prosecutor, and I was also a political appointee in the criminal division at the Department of Justice during the Bush administration. I have to tell you, I am very proud to stand up here with these committed conservatives who care about public safety and are also trying to help formerly incarcerated individuals become productive, law-abiding members of society rather than returning to a life of crime. The Heritage Foundation has been involved in this effort for years. We realize, of course, and completely support the notion that drug dealers and other types of nonviolent offenders, or just offenders, should be punished. The question, of course, is for how long? With respect to some low-level drug offenders and some other nonviolent offenders, perhaps the pendulum has swung too far. As well, as you've heard, 95% of the people who are presently incarcerated will, at some point, be released back into our neighborhoods. And we should care deeply about what kind of shape they are going to be in when they are released. The status quo, high recidivism rates, nearly 50% for federal inmates, over 75% for state inmates, is simply unacceptable. The First Step Act will provide low-risk offenders who could become productive members of society the opportunity to take and complete evidence-based programs designed to address some of the underlying issues that cause them to head down the wrong path in life. It is my hope that this bill will become law. I believe sincerely that in the long run, it will lead to less crime and redeemed lives. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Holden. I am Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries, and also the chairperson for Freedom Partners. And it's an honor to be here today with my fellow conservatives to talk about this great bill, the First Step Act. And for me, it's kind of summed up in the whole idea of when we know better, we need to do better. And that's what the states have shown the last 10 to 15 years, that rehabilitation programs, diversionary programs, things of that nature, evidence-based practices, that's what reduces crime rates. People have talked about Texas a lot. I'm from Massachusetts, but I do admire Texas at least in one thing, the way they've fought back against crime, reduced crime rates now to a level they haven't seen since the mid-1960s, closed 8 prisons, saved billions of dollars in the process. And they've set the blueprint for what we can do at the federal level. And for too long in the federal level, really nothing has happened. And for us at Koch Industries and Freedom Partners, we look at it from a moral perspective, a constitutional perspective, and a fiscal perspective. And every one of those boxes are clicked here with the First Step Act. You talk about the moral case. We have a 2-tiered system, justice system. We have a system now that really overemphasizes punitive measures. It doesn't provide redemption or restorative justice. That will be changed by this bill. If you look at the constitutional perspective, what we've done the last 30 or 40 years, in my opinion, with the disproportional sentencing, lack of lawyers for people that need them, you name it, across the board, we haven't followed the Bill of Rights. But this bill, once it becomes law, will allow that to happen as well. And then the last piece is the fiscal piece. And as I like to say, that this all started because people wanted to save money. So they came in for the savings, but they stayed for the salvation. And that's what this is all about. So we're very excited about this. We are literally like on the 5-yard line. And everyone's been praising different leaders here. Definitely the president, Jared Kushner, Leader McConnell for putting it on the floor, and this great coalition we have. So we're very excited about this, but we got to keep grinding. We got to keep hanging around the hoop. We can't take anything for granted. And if we get this done, it will be a great, great victory for everyone in society, particularly coming into the holiday season. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Ackerman. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Prison Fellowship. We are the nation's largest nonprofit dedicated to serving incarcerated men and women, those returning to society, and their families. As many of you know, we were founded by the late Chuck Colson, who was in the Nixon administration and got caught up in the Watergate scandal. And while he was in prison, he discovered that men, and by proxy women, are amongst the most marginalized in society. So he started Prison Fellowship 42 years ago, and we get to serve in prisons every day. I have a few prepared comments I'd like to share with you. The First Step Act will make America safer. It will help our national addiction crisis. It will build readiness to fuel local economies. Instead of doubling down on failed practices of the past, it will give people the tools to build better lives for themselves and their families. From our point of view, the sentencing changes in this bill are modest but important. When people receive sentences that don't fit their crime, America loses. Disproportionate sentences are an affront to the dignity of people made in the image of God. And they erode faith in the notion of equal justice under the law. One of the most important parts of the First Step Act are provisions that would increase the access to faith-based and nonprofit organizations to provide desperately needed programming in the federal system. From our work in many states, like some of the states mentioned, like Texas and Georgia and others, we can say without hesitation that these programs are game changers. They put people on a new path to reduce crime. Our most intensive program at Prison Fellowship is something called the Prison Fellowship Academy. We have academies in 86 prisons in 27 states. The Academy is a year-long intensive program designed to address the criminogenic thinking and behavior of men and women in prison with a curriculum that's grounded in a biblical worldview. We don't have one academy in a federal facility yet, but the First Step Act will allow this to happen. So, lastly, I'd just like to say, a vote against the First Step Act is a vote against the efforts of the faith community, as Bishop Jackson and as Pastor Paula made a moment ago, to transform the lives of prisoners who will soon return to our communities. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Adam Brandon. I am the president of Freedom Works. It's kind of exciting. We're at the finish line, guys. So I appreciate this coalition. We're getting there. I feel momentum's being built just looking at everyone that's here. One number that keeps being mentioned, 95% of all criminals are back on the streets. We're going to walk around with these folks on a daily basis. You're going to encounter these folks on a daily basis. For our own security, I think it's a good idea if we help them become productive members of society. We're living in a time right now of under 4% unemployment. If you're going to move these folks into the productive members of society, this is the time right now. This economy needs jobs. It needs this training. I'm getting chills thinking about the generational opportunity that we have here. So on behalf of the Freedom Works community, and I know there's tens of thousands watching live right now on Facebook, we appreciate what the community's doing, driving the messages. Let's keep up that momentum and get this thing done.
Hello, my name is Timothy Head. I'm the Executive Director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. And with our almost 2 million members across the country, we sometimes get a question: why is the justice system and justice reform such a priority for the Faith and Freedom Coalition? We're known for other issues like life and marriage and religious liberty, human trafficking, other issues like this. And so, when people ask this question, why such an emphasis? Why such a legislative priority on this? My answer is threefold. First of all, this is an issue of safety. It's intuitive, but clearly an issue of safety. Secondly, an issue of trust, and a third is it's a question of hope. So safety, fascinatingly enough, this issue, when done correctly, as we've seen in states across the country, when you provide appropriate programming and provide accountability, a lower justice system and prison system can actually lead to more safety. People, even now on the federal level, are talking about, we're letting people out. This is going to lead to danger. Ironically, in 30 states, we've actually demonstrated empirically that appropriate programming will actually make us safer. Secondly, on the trust issue, we unfortunately, on a global scale, even in the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice just a few months ago, we saw a real erosion in public trust in not only our judicial system, but overall on our justice system writ large. And we believe that law enforcement, that our bench, and prosecutors, for that matter, they need public trust, to be able to function and to provide the safety that we all need and deserve. And lastly, when it comes to hope, as we've talked about here, Scripture, frankly, at the core of Christian Scripture, is actually the premise that people can change. Now, unfortunately, everybody won't change, but many people, I would argue even most people, when given the opportunity, will change. So what happens whenever someone is injected into a system and really there is no potential, there's no legitimate hope for change for 20 years, 30 years, 55 years, as we heard? Is there an incentive for this person other than just pure altruism, maybe? Is there an external motivation to do this, to reconnect with my family, to be able to live a meaningful life, contribute to society, etc.? Well, right now the federal system doesn't provide that incentive or that hope. And so this bill provides not only for hope for each individual person entering the system or currently in the system, it also provides, it reinstitutes or re-implements trust, I believe, not only in our bench, but also in our law enforcement community. And thirdly, this absolutely empirically will provide safety that our country actually deserves from our justice system. So on behalf of our 1.8 million members across the country, it's Faith and Freedom Coalition's pleasure for the last 4 years to labor in the trenches with so many people here today, and members of the legislature in the House and the Senate. We look forward in the coming days to not only seeing a successful vote in the Senate, but we want to see a celebration in the Oval Office of the kind of reinstitution of these essential elements of good governance. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm David Safavian, and I'm the General Counsel for the American Conservative Union. I'm proud to stand here with people that I can call friends in this labor of love. People ask me why American Conservative Union is engaged in criminal justice reform. Our core principles encompass 3 elements. We talk about government responsibility and accountability, not just with taxpayer dollars, but with the way that they treat us, the citizens. We talk about the importance of redemption, that every human life has value. But most of all, and paramount, is public safety. The First Step Act delivers on all 3 of those goals. Opponents of the First Step Act have had ample time to review the legislation. Indeed, for the better part of the last year, they have picked it apart. They've tried to negotiate changes to gut the bill. They've demagogued it with their constituents. And they've attempted to sow seeds of fear with their colleagues. They do all this all while ignoring actual evidence and the real world experience that we've seen in the states. And we're not talking about states like Mark Holden's Massachusetts. We're talking about dark red states with very conservative governors. I suppose facts and data are stubborn things for our opponents. More disconcerting from the ACU position is that these statists' cynical attempts to derail legislation with filibusters and with poison pill amendments. They list crimes that they claim are subject to early release when the language of the bill makes clear. Offenders remain in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons and they are subject to strict regulation. They would earn their way to completing time in a halfway house or home confinement, but only after they have proven using objective criteria that they're no longer a threat to public safety. Yet we still see demagoguery. The opponents of the First Step Act also ignore the fact that every single person who has been convicted of the crimes that they feign concern about will eventually be released back into their communities. Make no mistake, our opponents want the status quo. And the status quo is half the time the prison bureaucracy fails. Half the time people are released from federal prison and will be convicted of new crimes and end up back behind bars. In every case of recidivism, it's another victim, it is another crime, it's another prosecution, it's another trial, it's another prison cell, all funded with taxpayer dollars. Why people who claim to be conservative would continue to support a bureaucracy that fails half the time and fails to meet the needs of victims, fails to meet the needs of offenders, fails to change hearts and minds, leaves communities living in fear, and eats up billions of tax dollars, I just don't know. I'm sorry, but there is nothing conservative about protecting a non-functioning prison bureaucracy. Make no mistake about any of this. The approach taken by the opponents of the First Step Act would see offenders released from prison without any programming whatsoever. Their approach would make us all less safe. In contrast, we want offenders to leave prison as better versions of themselves, prepared to become productive, prepared to become better family people, prepared to re-enter society and take up a role that God envisioned for them. I would make one final point. Thousands of Americans have been sent to prison over the years for making false and misleading statements to government officials. It's unfortunate that a small handful of legislators are not held to the same standards when they attempt to mislead the American public. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Joe Lupino Esposito. I'm the Director of Rule of Law Initiatives at the Due Process Institute. And obviously we've already heard a lot of great things from everybody up here, so I'll try to be brief. I just want to point out a few things of what's been going on with this, with these laws over the number of years. First of all, I want us to go back about 30 years ago when many of these laws were put on the books. The idea was that the most serious drug traffickers would receive 10 years mandatory minimum sentences, and that other major players would receive 5 years. That was Congress's intent. I don't think I have to repeat again what the type of sentences we've been talking about here today, starting from Weldon Angelos at 55 years and all the other ones we've been discussing. This was not the intention of these laws. And unfortunately, we still have people today that are pushing the idea that punitive punishment for its own sake is what's going to stop crime. That is absolutely not true. And from the Due Process Institute's perspective, well, we like to say that we are lobbyists for the Constitution, right? We look at what the rule of law is supposed to be and what we ought to be focusing on. What we ought to be focusing on is the most dangerous criminals, because especially when we talk about conservative first principles, to take away someone's liberty is something very serious, and we need to consider it seriously and carefully. The idea that we will simply take away someone's liberty for a crime for essentially an indefinite amount of time We have no federal parole. We even have opponents who not only have opposed this bill, but they've proposed that we should get rid of the current protections that we have regarding good time credit. They have gone in the opposite direction, not only of what is right, but of also what the facts show us as well in regards to public safety. I'll make also one final point. What is very odd, especially from I think a lot of the advocates' perspective, is that for several years, there's been a lot of talk about how everyone would be very concerned about the sentencing reforms that would be coming up. So we had this bill passed in the House, which is primarily prison reform. We added in the sentencing reform in the Senate. And what did the opponents say? We have a problem with prison reform. This is what we are debating. All the talk about exceptions and who is going to be let out into early release, which it is not, as David just mentioned. None of that is true, and these are the points that are being stressed. Again, I'd like us to focus on what the rule of law actually is, what this bill actually says, and what it does. And what this bill will do is make our prison safer, as Commissioner Carrick mentioned. It'll make our community safer, as everybody here has mentioned, and it'll have a better, more efficient federal system. And that's what we're looking forward to seeing once President Trump signs this bill.
My name is Bob Woodson. I'm the founder and president of the Woodson Center, an organization that helps low-income leaders in 39 states to develop solutions from within low-income crime-infested neighborhoods. I define myself as a cardiac Christian whose political views are radical pragmatism. And I want to share with you one of our constituent groups in Las Vegas, Nevada, is doing something very innovative. John Ponder is an ex-offender. He's been in and out of jail since he was 14. He came to Christ 14 years ago in Las Vegas, began to set up a program called Hope for Prisoners. Well, John has now, in 6 hours, John has had that program evolved. He has counseled in reentry over 2,000 people with a 6% recidivism rate. Only 6% of the people come through. 40% of the mentors are police officers and members of law enforcement. In about 6 hours, John will host a Christmas party where 50 people in the prison will get on a bus and travel a few blocks to a church auditorium where companies in the city has set up furniture, so there will be 50 living rooms set up with Christmas trees. And they will be bused there, and they will be greeted by, some of the inmates will be holding their children for the first time. One man, his girlfriend was pregnant when he went in jail, and now he's 7 years. It'll be the first time he's ever held his child. And that shows you, and so this, we are very supportive of this. But John has earned the trust. The impact has been great. As I said, only 6% recidivists. But also because of the relationship between the law enforcement and these inmates, violent encounters between police officers and minority community has gone from 25 down to 6. Because of that was a byproduct of that relationship. It's supported by probation and judge. In fact, John's mentor team for himself is the FBI agent that locked him up, the prosecutor that prosecuted him, the judge that sentenced him. There's a video of the 4 of them sitting around smiling, but that they gave him guidance. That's an example of grace in action. Also, the trust that John has engendered in that community extends to the point where the prosecutor, a young man sent the prosecutor a letter threatening his life and the life of his family. He was due to be released in 1 year. Now, he could have done what most people would do, and that is having remained. But he called John Ponder to go and talk to the young man. When he read his jacket, the man's wife was murdered while he was in prison and his children was taken away. But John counseled this man at the suggestion of the prosecutor, and as a consequence, he is one of the most productive people there. And so this bill would support these kind of community-based reentry programs where every one of these people who came out of prison are now working, supporting families, and the program also encourages families. And so I urge you to support this legislation so we can begin to develop other community-based reentry programs that have the impact of transforming lives and rebuilding communities. Thank you.
Amen.
I'll keep my statement short. Brent Bozell, I'm the chairman of For America with 8 million Facebook fans. It's my belief that when so many conservatives come together with so many liberals, one of two things has happened. Either the earth has spun off its axis, or it makes common sense what we're supporting. Everyone has been giving numbers. I scratch my head and I ask myself, when incarceration rates have gone up 800% in a 40-year period, when you've got the recidivism of over 76% over a 5-year period, when we're spending $7 billion a year on a prison system, it's not working. We have to say to our friends on Capitol Hill who are not with us, you must put your pride aside. We know in this city, this is a dirty little secret I'm going to share with everyone because nobody knows this. No one likes to means test the program in this town. No one likes to look and see the effect of what was done because everyone wants to think that their program was a good program. And if it isn't working, you just throw more money at it. When you clearly means test this and clearly see it's not working and see the solutions at the state level are working, you have no excuse other than pride. So I would ask the few holdout conservatives, please put away your pride and in this Christmas season, listen to the better angels of your nature. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Derek Cohen of Right on Crime. When we launched Right on Crime 8 years ago with our friends at the American Conservative Union and Prison Fellowship, we saw, and many of the folks up here today, we realized that the sentiments that you had just heard were not some peculiarities in dark corners of the conservative movement. These were beliefs sincerely held by rock-ribbed conservatives all throughout the country. Now, you'll forgive me, by this point of the press conference, all the good sports metaphors have been used. But we are now on the precipice of passing a moderate body of reform that will make communities safer, that will control costs, and that will provide redemption for those seeking to find it. Conservative states have led the way. Conservative legislators are leading the fight on Capitol Hill. And our conservative groups up here are here to say, among us and with voices throughout the country, that this is the policy we want, and this is the right policy. With that, I would like to conclude our comments and open up to the question and answer portion of this of the program and recognize Diana Bannister to run the show. Thank you.
Yes, if you have an individual you'd like to ask individually or to the general group. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Frank Lockwood. I write for the Arkansas Democratic Gazette.